Um, so it's Valentine's weekend. If that's a shock to you, you may be in more trouble than I can help you with this morning. I did feel like maybe I wanted to start this morning and say to the singles in the crowd, okay, if you're a single person here at Journey, I really prayed for you this weekend. I hope you survived the social media onslaught that happened this weekend when it comes to Valentine's Day, right? We did think that Valentine's Day would be a fun weekend to start this new series, Love Everyone Always. Not because, listen to me, not because it's going to be a marriage series, all right? David's going to talk to you in just a minute. We've got a marriage workshop coming up very soon, a 5-week workshop that we want to invite you to, invite your neighbors to. It's going to be really fun. But this is not about marriage per se. This is going to be a series talking about the idea of love and relationships and what that looks like. So I wanted to kick that off today and just say to you, listen, this is not just for married people, okay? So don't hide if you're single. Come back, stay engaged. If you're married and you want to dive more into your relationship, pay attention a little bit and we'll get you signed up for that workshop, okay? In 1967, about 100,000 hippies gathered in San Francisco. That shouldn't shock anybody, but there it is. About 100,000 hippies gathered in San Francisco, 1967. In fact, that gathering would spur something. The whole summer would take on a name. I don't know of many summers that have been named where the whole country recognizes it, but does anybody know what the summer of 1967 is known as? The Summer of Love. Some of you know that a little too well. You might have been there in San Francisco. I don't know. It did become known as the Summer of Love. I always like to tell people we weren't feeling it much around our house because my dad was actually overseas at the time, right? So you understand what was going on at that time. So I don't know that it was much of a summer of love around our house, but it became known as the Summer of Love. Later that summer, the Beatles would write a song for another music festival. And this music festival actually would be the first of its kind because it was going to be a global music festival. 1967, towards the end of the summer, a global music festival. The song they wrote would become the anthem for that summer. It would become a protest song for people who didn't like the war. It would become just a song of feeling good about the summer. It would become a song that everybody related to, especially in the hippie movement. Okay, it would become kind of an oath for hippies. And I, believe it or not, it would become a song that I know you're going to know this song. It would become a song that would be played at weddings after weddings after weddings, not just in America, but all around the world. It was a crazy time. This song that was written is called All You Need Is Love. And listen, if you were born after Y2K, you even know this song, right? That's how popular this song is. I'm going to put the chorus up because I want to show you that when John Lennon wrote this song, he wanted it to be very simple. He wanted it to be simple because it was going to be a global music festival where it would be first played. And so he knew people would hear this across the globe on different continents. And the idea of love doesn't always translate in certain ways, right? So he wanted to keep it very, very simple. And here's the chorus. I'll read it to you because it's tough. Love, 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 love. Okay? At the end of the service, we're going to have a little test. And if you can't tell me the chorus, you don't get to leave today. All right? We're going to keep you here all week, make you clean the church, right? He kept it simple for a reason because he wanted it to relate to people. Now, here's what happened, though. He came up with his verses that I find a little more unique. In fact, to me, I have never really gotten the verses. The chorus I get, I think, although I don't know that we agree on what love is, right? But I get it. I get what he's saying. The chorus, the verse is actually very different. Look at the first verse. We're just going to look at the first verse. It says, there's nothing you can do that can't be done. Nothing you can sing that can't be sung. Nothing you can say, but you can learn how to play the game. It's easy. Huh? I mean, I've got a master's degree, and I'm not really sure what that means. And here's the problem. It makes me a little nervous because if 100,000 hippies or all the hippies across the world started to relate to this song, I'm thinking, I ought to be able to figure this song out, right? And then I actually ran across a quote, and I'm going to just show you part of the quote, but this made me feel so much better. Paul McCartney said this. He goes, I've never really understood it. The message is rather complex when talking about the verse. Okay, if Paul McCartney didn't get it, I feel better about myself. He didn't get it. But listen, the melody was simple. The chorus was simple. It resonated with people, right? Love is a globally embraced notion. It's something that we get, right? It's something that we want to hold on to. It's something that we think we understand, or at least it pulls us together. Here's the problem. It might be globally embraced as an idea. It's globally missing in practice, though, right? Look at the governments today. We've got governments fighting. We've got hatred inside of borders and out, right? We've got racism raising its head over and over again. It might be a globally embraced notion, but it seems impossible to express for some reason. And that's where I want to start this morning. This idea that love seems to be hard to express. What is that about? And I'm going to propose one simple thought to you as we start. That the reason love is hard to express is because to express love is a direct result of our definition of love. If you want to express love, you've got to have some kind of definition of love. You've got to know what you're working with, right? Otherwise, it's hard to express. Or at least what you express, you're not sure how to define it. It's interesting when you go to the American Heritage Dictionary, which I do a lot to look up words like this, they've got a really simple definition for love. Look, it says, an intense affection for another person based on familial or personal ties. Simple. This affection, intense affection for another person based on some relationship that you have with them, it just seems so simple. But if it's simple, why is it so hard to express? I'm going to take you to 1 John this morning for a few minutes. I like the book of 1 John. It's an interesting book. We believe that John the Apostle is actually the author of this little book. He's the one that also wrote the very last book that's in the Bible, the book of Revelation. He was writing this at a time when he was still in the area of Ephesus. So we really figured that he was writing it to all of these Christians who lived in and around this area, these churches that were all scattered around there. And as he wrote, the first two chapters of the letter, which they weren't chapters back then, but the first that we've divided it, the first two chapters would focus on this with God life that we've been talking about around here. The most important thing that we think you can do is discover a life with God, right? That's what we believe is important, that God wants to invite you into. And John's writing about it, and he's talking about walking with God, walking in the light and the understanding of who Jesus Christ really is. And then in the last chapters, he gets into kind of a practical discussion of what that looks like. He starts to talk about the impact on a follower of Jesus Christ, what it means to walk with God and then have that love come out as an expression, right? As he does that, I want to pick it up, and we're going to go to verse 7 of chapter 4. Read along with me. He says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love." Now, let me just throw a little caveat in here. I get that depending on where you're at in your relationship with Jesus Christ, I get that this can seem like a pretty narrow definition of love. I bet you run with friends, right? People who don't follow Jesus who would say, come on now. So you're saying that for me to actually love somebody, I have to know God. That seems to be implied in the verse. That seems pretty narrow. I get that people think that way, right? I get that you don't have to be a follower of Jesus Christ to be in a relationship that you would say is a loving relationship, whether it's a friendship or any other kind, right? I get that there's criticism of Christians today about how well the church does or doesn't love, right? You've heard the expression, the church is the only organization or group that shoots its wounded, right? You've heard this? It's a criticism of churches. It's a criticism of Christians. I get that that's out there. I even get that it seems like there are, and sometimes not just seems like, but there are groups that express love inside their group, maybe in ways better than the church does at times. I get that all of that exists. I get that when we talk about love, this is the framework. We've got to peel all of that back to begin to decide if we really even understand the concept of love. I agree that there might be some accuracy in all of those assessments and criticisms, but remember, our expression of love is going to come from our definition of love. So at the end of the day, groups may have what they call love being expressed, but we're going to look at what John would say is the heart of love. We're going to look at what John would say is where love originates, not just originates, but what it should really look like. So how's he defining love? I want you to notice two phrases. Go back to those verses real quick. Verse 7. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is where? From God. Underline that. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is what? Love. So there are these two phrases that he puts in there, that love comes from God and that God is love, and we tend to gravitate to the second one. In fact, you probably have heard this, right? It does. Again, you don't have to be a follower of Jesus. People will say all the time, well, God is love, right? We love that phrase. It's the go-to phrase in our culture. Well, God is love. God is love. And when you say that, the question is, well, what are you really saying? To me, it's a really incomplete statement, because you still haven't defined love. You said God is love, but you didn't tell me what love is. You just told me that it's Him. And when you do that, do you realize that you're saying that God, His nature, His being, He just is love? Right? It feels very squishy. It's a partial understanding of who God really is, but that's how we like to think about it. It's the go-to statement. We go straight to the second verse and we forget the first verse, and we kind of separate this thing and we don't put it together. We take it out of context and we just say, well, God is love. And people will say that all the time today. And when you do that, and maybe you've done that, and I've done it before in the past, I've kind of thrown it out there in passing. When you do that, you're leaving people with a poor understanding of what love is. And you're really leaving them with an incomplete understanding of who God is. Right? The whole Bible is this story, and God is talking to us in this story and revealing Himself all along the way. And the simple fact of the matter is, there's all of these descriptors and all these conversations and all these things that God says, this is who I am. And even in Hebrews 13, He'll say, I'm the same. I've been the same yesterday, today, tomorrow. I'm always the same. I don't change, right? That's who we see God is. He's unchanging. And if we don't better define love, if I leave that word in the hands of everybody to define, well, all of a sudden, God is changing. Do you follow me? He's changing because my definition might be different from your definition of love and who God is. So there has to be something deeper here. There has to be something more than just saying God is love and leaving it at that and leaving it that soft. Go back, verse 7. I'm going to read it to you one more time. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. In other words, love starts somewhere. Love, God is love, but God is love as evidenced by His love. It comes from Him. Whatever love is comes from Him. It's not just a description of his nature and leaving it removed from His actions. In other words, God did something, and that was love. You can't just describe God as love and separate love from His actions. It's an incomplete understanding of love. You ever have a friend? I had one in college that every time we got together, and man, we were tight. We were good friends. I knew this guy was my good friend, one of my best friends. But when we would hang out, I could never get a story in edgewise. You have one of those friends? And I'm a talker, all right? My wife will tell you that I'm a talker. I fess up. I get it. I could not get a story in. I was never asked to tell a story. I wasn't invited to talk about myself. I wasn't invited to share where I was at, what was going on. It just wasn't happening. I had that kind of a friend where everything was focused on their story, right? Where it was always about them. And I was never invited into that space. The actions of that friend didn't really reveal that I was such a good friend. If I had stopped and really thought about it, the actions, I'm sure they didn't intend it that way. I'm sure they didn't mean it that way, but the actions never invited me to be a part of the relationship. I was just kind of always a tag on in the relationship. Watch what John does when he keeps talking, verse 9. He begins to open this thing up a little bit. If love stems from an action from God, look at how he describes it in verse 9. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us. Okay, so he's going to tell us a story, and he's going to tell us what it is that makes the love of God manifest so we can see it. That God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love. Not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation, the substitute for our sins. Love is defined by John in the context of life with God begins with an intentional act of love by God. It's manifested. It's manifested in Jesus being sent by God. It's manifested in Jesus volunteering to go from God. In both of those acts, we receive. They don't originate from us. In both of those acts that manifest the love of God, that manifest that God is love, that manifest what love is, we receive. They don't originate from us. And we discover that love is this action that rises above our emotions in that story. That love must be an act. It can't just be an emotion. Now, I'm not going to try to argue with you. I never would. I do believe emotions are good. My wife will tell you sometimes I don't believe that, but that I think she's being overly harsh with me. I'm not always a touchy-feely kind of a person, but I do believe emotions are good. I believe we're wired with emotions. I believe you should observe your emotions. I think you should pay attention to your emotions, right? They're not bad and they're not evil. But as John begins to unpack love for us, I want you to understand and see that it originates from an act of God's will, his volition, that it's not just emotion alone. If we leave it there, if we leave it just as emotion, here's what we get. A culture that says, just follow your heart. Right? You guys have heard this from me for the last year. I keep talking about it because it keeps growing in our culture. The follow your heart syndrome. It just seems like everybody is advertising this way of living your life, right? Just follow your heart. Do what you think is right. Do what you think is best. The problem is, I know what's in my heart sometimes, and you don't want me following my heart. And I don't want you always following your heart either, right? Nobody has the same emotions. Our emotions are all different sometimes. My wife and I emote differently. And we have to learn to work together on that, right? And you have to learn to work in your relationships with other people. With those emotions come out differently. You don't want somebody else's emotions being pinned on you. You don't want to pin your emotions on somebody else necessarily, right? So this follow your heart will get us into trouble. God is love, but it's not this squishy, intangible thing. It's very tangible, and it's evidenced in his act. This act that defined his relationship with us. Write this down. Love begins with an act of our will, not an appetite for our wants. Love begins with an act of our will, not an appetite for our wants. I'm not trying to discount your desires, your passions. Those are God-wired a lot of times, but we can allow those things to run off the track and get us in trouble. And if we define everything by our appetite, right, we will get in trouble. My birthday dinner last month, my wife and my son took me to one of my favorite places. It's a steak restaurant. That shouldn't shock anybody. They do not serve the almost burger there, or whatever that thing is called now. It's just not a place that they would serve that. And it's a great steak restaurant. But when I go, I have a dilemma with my appetite. because I love steak. So there's several sizes of steak, and if you're a steak lover and you're going to have a good steak, you probably don't opt for the small portion, right? And I know within my head that day that the day is coming, and there's going to be a lot of eating that day, and it will culminate with my cherry cheesecake that my wife makes for me. It's my grandmother's recipe, and every year on my birthday, that's what I get. So I know the cheesecake is coming. It's going to culminate. It's a once-a-year thing. I don't eat it all the time because I don't need it all the time. But at the same time, my appetite says, yeah, but that big steak is just looking good, right? So, of course, you know the end of this story. I get the big steak. And for several days, my cheesecake sat in the refrigerator. I didn't touch it because I was so full at the end of the day. If we let our appetites drive our emotions, drive our decisions, drive what we call love, it's going to get us in trouble. So yes, love does begin with an act of our will, not just an appetite for our wants, and we have to distinguish that. In fact, I'll go you one better. If you don't begin to distinguish that, what Jesus says, the rest of his words are going to drive you nuts. Go to Matthew 5, verse 44. He says, I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. If my appetite, if my drives, if my desires, if my passions rule my heart, I would never pray for my enemy. I just wouldn't. And don't act all holier than thou. You wouldn't either. You're sitting there looking at me like, oh, we got this down. No, you don't, because I don't. There's just nothing in me that says, pray for my enemy. This person that's opposing me in some way. And maybe it's not even a big way. Maybe it's just my neighbor and I don't like the color he painted the trim of his house. And now all of a sudden he's my enemy because he's dropping my property values or something, right? I mean, don't look at me like that. You know what I'm thinking here. This is the problem with our drives and desires. When they are in control, we'll never even get close to what Jesus is inviting us into. That we replace being controlled by our drives and our desires with an act of will that's been shown to us by our Savior, modeled to us, is transforming our own hearts and our minds. And we'll be confronted with those moments, and they're going to be hard. We'll struggle through but love has to become an act of our will, or those drives and desires and passions are going to ruin any kind of love that we might be able to model. Yes, it's going to be hard. Yes, it's going to be impossible at times. It's going to feel like. Yes, it's hard to respond when people are not responding well to you. Yes, it feels counterintuitive to love your enemy. But the reality is, God has offered us something that should transform our thinking about how we love others. Go back to 1 John, verse 11. Beloved, if God so loved us, how did he love us? He sent his son. Jesus offered to go. If God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us and his love is perfected in us. God's a standard of love. He acted first. He showed mercy first. He could have left us with the first judgment, right? You know this. If you don't remember it, the story of Genesis, when Adam and Eve rebelled, when they said, we want to be like you, we don't want to follow you, we don't want to be with you, and they decided to eat the forbidden fruit. When they acted out like that, when they rebelled, when they pushed back, they had already been told what would happen. And God could have left them there with that judgment right then. He could have let that be the end of the story, but he offered mercy. He could have let the punishment fit the crime, but he didn't. He offered mercy. And his actions rose above the emotions of the moment. And we have the opportunity now, right? We have the opportunity to either allow our appetites to take over so that we treat our neighbors, we treat the people around us, we treat the people in our office spaces, we just allow our desires and our wants and our lusts to control us. which you don't want from me when you're driving on 75 with me, especially if you cannot go faster than me. Right? If that's what we allow to control us, what's going to happen? Bad things are going to come out of us. Or we can let God define love. We can let God define love. We can let his actions be the model for us and his heart be the transformation in us, right? Seeking the good, seeking the restoration, seeking the reconciliation of the people around us. I love the second verse there, verse 12. He says, nobody's ever seen God. John will write about this in other places, about how nobody has seen God except Jesus. And that is an amazing claim, because what he does is he sets it up like this, church. In fact, if anybody ever says to you, I love Jesus, but I just don't know that going to church or being a part of a church or being a part of an organization is that big of a deal, this answers all of that. As he says, nobody's seen God, but here's what's going to happen. People are going to see love in you and your community. That's what's happening here. The community is going to display love in the way we act towards each other, and the way we put everybody else's drives and desires and passions in front of our own. We help people when we don't have to, right? Even though it's hard, even though we don't always get along. And there's people in churches that you don't get along with, right? There's personalities here that we're not all the same people. But in spite of that, we're together. And he says, that's how the world's going to see my love. They're going to see it acted out in you. That's why community matters. That's why it's vital. Ultimately, write this down, God didn't love you according to your merits, but according to his mercy. He didn't love you according to your merits. You can't earn it. You can't be good enough. But he loved you according to his mercy. And you know what he asks in response? You extend that mercy. That you love everyone always. That you love everyone always, and that you start here with the community. And as the community begins to practice that and live into it, the world's going to see something that they all want. It's why a Beatles song will go global, singing about love with simple lyrics. The world wants to experience that, but it's not happening. And this is where it starts to happen. And this is where the world can take notice. And this is where God can do his work. When we begin to love everyone always. I love C.S. Lewis. He said it this way. He said, love is not affectionate feelings, but a steady wish for the loved person's ultimate good as far as it can be obtained. Love. Let our actions rise above our emotions. Love everyone always. We're about to go into communion. I'm going to ask the band to come up, but as they do, I want to offer you a couple of thoughts here. Or at least questions. Do you know that kind of love? Because I get most of us, we've grown up on this planet together, and some of us come from homes and even churches where love was not modeled this way. Love was driven by emotions. It was driven by fear. It was driven by these things that caused us to get hurt. It never modeled the love of Christ in this way. Is that you? Is that all you've ever known? Is that what God would be saying to you this morning? Is that what he would be getting you to think about? Like maybe you've never rejected Jesus. You've never said, I don't like him. You like his message, but really the question is, but are you embracing the love that he really offered you in such a way that it changes your actions, that your actions rise above your emotions, that you have that ability to love everyone always, and you're living into it more and more?